The focus of this article is part of a general political movement in Western Ukraine of the 19th and early 20th century. The movement contained several competing branches: Moscophiles, Ukrainophiles, Rusynphiles, and others. Western Ukrainian Russophiles were participants in a cultural and political movement largely in the Western Ukraine. This ideology emphasized that since the Eastern Slavic people of Galicia were descendants of the people of Kievan Rus, and followers of Eastern Christianity, that they were thus a branch of the Russian people. The movement was part of the whole pan-Slavism that was developing in the late 19th century. Russophilia was largely a reaction against Polish and Hungarian cultural suppression that was largely associated with Roman Catholicism. Russophilia has survived longer among the Russian minority, especially those in Carpathy and Ruthenia, the Lemkos of southeast Poland, and those in Bukovina. Terminology: the Russophiles did not apply the term to themselves and called themselves Russians, Ruthenians or Russini. Some Russophiles coined such terms as Obshki Rossiyastar or Russini to stress either the differences within the faction, referring to commonness with all Russians, or the unique stand within the whole of the Russian nation. The ethnonym Ruthenians for Ukrainian people had been accepted by both the Russophiles and the Moscophiles for quite a long period of time. The new name Ukrainians began to be accepted by the Ruthenian Galicians around the 1890s, under the influence of Mykola Kostomarov and the Brotherhood of Saints Cyril and Methodius in central Ukraine. Background: after the fall of the westernmost East Slavic state in 1349, most of the area of what is now Western Ukraine came under the control of Poland and Hungary, with Poland ruling Galicia and Hungary controlling Carpathy and Ruthenia. The loss of independence began a period of gradual, centuries-long assimilation of much of the native elite into Polish and Hungarian culture. These elite adopted a national orientation in which they saw the native Rus population of Galicia as a branch of the Polish nation who happened to be of the Eastern Christian faith. They believed that the native language was merely a dialect of Polish, comparable to Masovian, and that assimilation would be inevitable. This process of Polonization was, however, resented by the peasants, the clergy, and small minority of nobles who retained their East Slavic culture, religion or both. The latter two groups would form the nucleus of native national movements that would emerge with the loosening of Polish and Hungarian control in Western Ukraine, which occurred when the entire region came under the control of the Austrian Habsburgs in the course of the partitions of Poland. The Austrian emperor emancipated the serfs, introduced compulsory education, and raised the status of the Ruthenian priest to that of the Polish and Hungarian counterparts. Furthermore, they mandated that Ukrainian Catholic seminarians receive a formal higher education, and organized institutions in Vienna and Lviv that would serve this function. This led to the appearance, for the first time, of a large educated social class within the Ukrainian population in Galicia. Austrian reforms led to a gradual social mobilization of the native inhabitants of Western Ukraine and the emergence of several national ideologies that reflected the natives' East Slavic culture and were opposed to that of Roman Catholic Poland and Hungary. This development was encouraged by the Austrian authorities because it served to undermine Polish-Hungarian control of the area. The cultural movements included Russophilia, the idea that Galicia was the westernmost part of Russia and that the natives of Western Ukraine were, like all of the Russian Empire's East Slavic inhabitants, members of one Russian nation. Ruthenianism, the idea that the people of Western Ukraine were a unique East Slavic nation, and Ukrainophilia, the idea that the people of Western Ukraine were the same as those of neighboring lands in the Russian Empire, but that both were a people different from Russians, Ukrainians. Initially there existed a fluidity between all three national orientations, with people changing their allegiance throughout their lives, and until approximately the turn of the 20th century members of all three groups frequently identified themselves by the ethnonym Ruthenians. Initially the most prominent ideology was Ruthenianism, or Rusynphiles. Its proponents, referred to as Old Ruthenians, were mainly wealthy or more influential priests and the remnants of the nobility who had not been Polonized, and were quite loyal to the Habsburgs, to whom they owed the higher social standing, while emphasizing the separateness from the Poles in terms of religion and background. These people nevertheless maintained an elitist attitude towards the peasantry. They frequently spoke the Polish language among themselves, and tried to promote a version of Church Slavonic with elements of the local Ukrainian vernacular as well as the Russian language as a literary language for Western Ukraine. This language was never standardized. However, the language actually spoken by the common people was viewed with contempt. Old Ruthenians rejected both Ukrainophilism and Russophilism. The Ukrainian thinker Mikhailo Drahomyanov read ironically of them, that you Galician intellectuals really do think of creating some kind of uniate Paraguay with some kind of hierarchical bureaucratic aristocracy, just like you have created an Austro-Ruthenian literary language. Old Ruthenianism dominated Galicia's cultural scene until the mid-19th century, when it was supplanted by Russophilia ideology. The early Galician Russophile Nikolai Kamasykevich wrote an article in 1834 stating that the Russians were the same people from Western Ukraine to Kamchatka, for the White Sea to the Black Sea, and the language they spoke was the same Russian language. He wrote that the standard Russian language was more acceptable for modern writing and that the popular dialects in Ukraine were corrupted by Polish influence. These ideas were stimulated by the Russian pan-slavist Mikhail Pogodin, who stayed in Lviv in 1835 and 1839 to 1840 and who during this time influenced the local Ruthenian intelligentsia, no longer seeing themselves as representatives of a small Ruthenian nation of under 3 million people, weak in comparison to its neighbors. The Russophiles now saw themselves as the westernmost branch of the great Russian people. A Russian orientation also played into the Russophiles' elitist tendencies, because the Russian literary language which they tried to adopt set the Russophile priests and nobles apart from the Ukrainian-speaking peasants. Politically, the Russophiles came to advocate the idea of a union between a Galician Ruthenia and Russia. One of the most active of the Galician Russophiles was the prominent historian nobleman Denis Zubritsky, who helped convert many of the Galician elite to his cause. He was also the first to begin writing in Standard Russian. As early as 1849 he started his main work, The History of the Ancient Galician Russian Principality. In a letter to his friend Mikhail Pogodin, Zubritsky claimed that his stated purpose was to acquaint his Galician people with Russian history and the Russian language. Indeed, the historiography of the medieval kingdom of Galicia-Volhynia was largely begun by Galician Russophiles and served as the basis for their nation-building project. In terms of literature and culture, the Russophiles promoted Nikolai Gogol and Ivan Naumovich in contrast to Ukrainophile emphasis on Taras Shevchenko. In terms of language, Galician Russophiles were strongly opposed to the adoption of the vernacular Ukrainian language spoken by peasants and instead supported the adoption of standard literary Russian. This opposition was such that they even welcomed the ban on the Ukrainian language in the Russian Empire in 1876. reflecting the belief that the people of Ukraine played a special role in the greater Russian nation. The leading Russophile thinker Ivan Naumovich declared that the Russian language was derived from Little Russian and was only being readopted in Galicia. Indeed, Galician Russophiles wrote that one of the reasons for all East Slavs to adopt the Russian language was that the modern Russian language had been created in the 17th and 18th centuries by scholars from Ukraine. Despite some democratic elements, Galician Russophilia tended to be anti-democratic and reactionary, placing it at odds with the democratic trends in 19th-century society. For example, the Russophile leader Denis Zubritsky defended serfdom both before and after the emancipation of Austrian Galician serfs in 1848. There were also anti-Semitic strains in Russophilism. For the 1860s to the 1880s, some peasants hoped that the Tsar would come to Galicia and slaughter the Poles and the Jews. During the Russian occupation of Galicia in 1914–1915, a Galician Russophile newspaper spread rumors of anti-Russian Jewish uprisings in order to justify anti-Semitic pogroms by Russian troops, and Russophiles working within the Russian administration united with right-wing Russian elements in urging the Russian government to solve the Jewish question by stripping Jews of Russian citizenship, expelling them to Germany and distributing the property among the local Ukrainian people. The latter appeals were ignored by the Russian military, who did not want excessive disruptions to the local economy during the war. Russophiles who had been installed by the Russian authorities as mayors in some towns proceeded to shut down Jewish schools. Rise and development. Western Ukrainian Russophilia appeared in Carpathian and Ruthenia at the end of the 18th century. At this time, several people from the region settled in St. Petersburg, Russia, and obtained high academic positions. The best known of these was Vasily Kukolnik, a member of an old noble family who had studied in Vienna before coming to Russia. Vasily's pupils included Grand Duke Konstantin Pavlovich of Russia and Grand Duke Nikolai Pavlovich of Russia, the future Emperor Nicholas I of Russia. These émigrés, while adopting a sense of Russian patriotism, also maintained their ties to the homeland and tried to use the wealth to introduce Russian literature and culture to the region. When the Hungarians revolted against the Austrians in 1848, the local East Slavs, antagonistic toward the Hungarians who had dominated them, were deeply moved by the presence of the seemingly invincible Russian troops sent by Nicholas to help crush the rebellion. At this time, Austria supported the Russophile movement as a counterbalance to Polish and Hungarian interests, and under the leadership of the Russophile nobleman Adolf Dobriansky, the people of Carpathian and Ruthenia were granted limited autonomy, although the region reverted to Hungarian control after a few years. In Galicia, Russophilia emerged as early as the 1830s, when Society of Scholars was organized in Przemysl and was stimulated in part by the presence in Lviv in 1835 and from 1839 to 1840 of Russian pan-slavist Mikhail Pogodin, who became acquainted with the local Ruthenian intelligentsia and became an influence on them. However, the movement did not come to dominate Western Ukrainian society until the 1850s-60s. Many proponents of Ruthenianism became disenchanted with Austria and linked themselves with the giant and powerful Russian state. The relative rise of Russia's power in comparison to that of Austria during the 19th century also played a role in such feelings. Events of the 1860s helped to increase pro-Russian feelings in Galicia. Traditionally, the local Ruthenians had a naive belief that the Habsburg Emperor was on the side and that he would defend them against the Polish nobility. For the late 1850s, Austrian courts often sided with nobles in land disputes with peasants, during which forests and pastures that the peasants had traditionally been using were deemed the property of the nobles. This led to significant economic hardship for the peasants. While this was happening, the Russian Tsar had emancipated the peasants in Russian-ruled Ukraine. In 1863 to 1864, an insurrection of Polish nobles in areas that included Russian-ruled Ukraine was brutally crushed by the Tsarist government, which in punishing the Polish rebels provided the Ukrainian peasants with relatively favorable compensation. Many Galicians began to approvingly contrast the Tsar's brutal treatment of the Polish nobles with the Austrians seemingly taking the Polish side. In the Polish-Ukrainian conflict, many of them came to believe that the plight of the Ukrainians was improving more under the Tsars than it was under the Austrians. In the testimony of one Austrian Ukrainian peasant, "If there is no justice in Vienna, we will find it in the Moscow." During this time, the poet and scholar Yakov Holovatsky, a member of the Ruthenian Trinity, joined the Russophile movement. Soon thereafter, the Russophile priests of the St. George Cathedral Circle came to dominate the local hierarchy of the Greek Catholic Church, thereby transforming the Church into an instrument of the cause. Russophiles took over Ruthenian academic institutions and the venerable Ruthenian newspaper Slovo, and under their leadership it became the most widely circulated newspaper among Western Ukrainians. In 1870, the Russophiles formed a political organization, the Ruthenian Council, which represented the population of Western Ukraine. For the 1860s until the 1880s, Western Ukrainian political, religious, and cultural life came to be dominated by the Russophiles. Pre-war decline and fall. Within a generation of achieving dominance of Western Ukrainian life, however, the Russophiles were eclipsed by the Ukrainophiles, also called populists, originally coming from the same social stratum as the Russophiles, but joined by the emerging secular intelligentsia. The Ukrainophiles were from a younger generation who, unlike the fathers, found enthusiasm for Taras Shevchenko rather than the Tsars, and embraced the peasantry rather than rejected it. This dedication to the people would prove successful against the Russophiles' elitist, top-down orientation. Many factors accounted for the collapse of the Russophile movement. The principal one was likely the Ukrainophiles' incredible capacity for organization. The populists fanned out throughout the countryside in order to mobilize the masses to the cause. In 1868, the Lviv student Anatoly Vaknin organized and became the first head of the Prosvita organization, whose goal was to organize reading rooms and community theaters which became extremely popular among the peasants. In order to help the impoverished peasants, Ukrainophile activists set up cooperatives that would buy supplies in large quantities, eliminate middlemen, and pass the savings on to the villages. Credit unions were created, providing inexpensive loans to farmers and eliminating the reliance on non-Ukrainian money lenders. Russophiles belatedly tried to imitate such strategies but could not catch up. By 1914, Prosvita had 3,000 reading rooms while the Russophile version, the Kachkovsky Society, had only 300. The Ukrainian Cooperative Union had 900 members, while the rival Russophile one had only 106. Prevented from publishing in the mainstream Western Ukrainian newspapers by the Russophiles who controlled them, the populists created their own. In 1880, Dilo was founded as a rival to the Russophile Slovo, and due to the rising literacy of the Ukrainian population, its circulation surpassed that of its older rival. A second important factor for the success of the Ukrainophiles was the exile from Dnieper, Ukraine, of a large number of well-educated and talented Eastern Ukrainian writers and scholars, such as the writer Panteleimon Kulish, the former professor of Kiev's University of St. Vladimir, economist and philosopher Mikhailo Drahomanov, and especially the historian Mikhailo Rushevsky, who headed a newly established department at the University of Lviv. Many of these figures settled or lived for a time in Lviv. In contrast, no prominent Russian intellectuals came to Galicia in order to help the local Russophile cause. This phenomenon led to the ironic observation of Drahomanov that the Ukrainianophiles were actually more in touch with contemporary Russian cultural and intellectual trends than were the Russophiles, despite the latter group's love for Russia. Moreover, while educated Ukrainophiles were coming to Galicia from the Russian Empire, local Russophiles in Galicia experienced a brain drain, as many of them left Western Ukraine for positions in Russia. Many of classics teachers needed as a result of Russian educational reforms promoted by Dmitry Tolstoy in the 19th century were Galicians. From among the local intelligentsia, Ivan Franko showed the literary potential of the vernacular Ukrainian language. The local declining number of Russophiles could not compete with the talent of these Ukrainophile cultural figures and scholars. Help for the Ukrainophile cause from Eastern Ukraine also took the form of generous financial assistance from wealthy Ukrainian landowners. Due to restrictions against Ukrainian printing and the Ukrainian language imposed by the Tsarist government in Eastern Ukraine, Eastern Ukrainian noble Cossacks officer families who had not become Russified sent money to Galicia in order to sponsor Ukrainophile cultural activities there. These people, enjoying gentry status, were generally much wealthier than the priests and priests' sons who dominated the local Galician movements. The amount sent by these private individuals from Russian-ruled Ukraine to Ukrainophile causes likely equaled the subsidies sent by the Russian government to Galician Russophiles. For example, Yelizaveta Miloradovich, a noblewoman from Poltava, donated 20,000 Austrian crowns to the Shevchenko Scientific Society. The Austrian government also contributed significantly to the Ukrainophiles' victory. Initially, Austria had supported Russophilia as a counterbalance to the Poles and Hungarians. During the latter part of the 19th century, as Austria-Hungary and Russia became rivals, the Austrian authorities became alarmed by the Russophiles' activities. To maintain the loyalty of the Ukrainian population, the Austrian authorities made concessions to Ukrainian causes, such as expanding the Ukrainian educational system, and in 1893 made the Ukrainophile version of the vernacular Ukrainian language the language of instruction. Doing so effectively shut the Russophiles out of the educational system. During the 1880s, the Austrians put many Russophiles on trial for treason or espionage. These trials were widely publicized, and served to discredit the Russophiles among the Ukrainian people, most of whom continued to be loyal to the Austrian emperor. One of the prosecutors was Kost-Levitsky, who later became an important Ukrainian politician. The Austrians also deported an editor of the Russophile newspaper Slovo and deposed the Russophile head of the Greek Catholic Church, Metropolitan Joseph Sembratovich. In 1899, Count Andrei Sheptytsky became new head of the Greek Catholic Church. A Polonized nobleman from an old Ukrainian family, he adopted the Ukrainian language and a Ukrainophile orientation. Although Sheptytsky did not interfere in priests' personal activities and writings, he slowly purged the church's hierarchy of Russophiles. Despite drawing some Ukrainophiles' criticism criticism for the slow progression of his changes. Under Sheptytsky's leadership, the Church gradually ceased being a bastion of Russophilism and instead became a staunchly Ukrainophile one, lacking support within their community and from the Austrian government. The remaining Russophiles turned to outsiders for support and became more radical in the politics. They founded the Russian National Party, called for complete identification with Russia and promoted the conversion of the Western Ukrainian people to Orthodoxy. The Russophiles now largely depended on financing from the Russian government and Russian private sponsors and from ultra-conservative Galician, Polish aristocrats. The Polish ultra-conservatives had become alarmed by the social mobilization of the Ukrainian peasants and sought to use the Russophile movement as a way of dividing the Ukrainian community. They were also united with the Russophiles in opposition to a proposed alliance between Ukrainophiles and politically moderate Poles. Polish support provided the Russophiles with some advantages during elections, some advantages for Russophile priests in obtaining parishes, and tolerance towards Russophile political activities. The Russophiles also attempted, with some limited success, to exploit the differences between Ukrainian petty gentry and peasants. The gentry were somewhat more likely to support Russophilia than were peasants. A noble candidate in the elections of 1911, Ivan Kulchitsky, declared, "Now we have recovered our sight and shall not allow the bastards to trick us with Ukraine. You should know that from now on we do not give a damn for Ukraine and have returned to the historical road. From now on we are Russians." Help from Russian and Polish patrons largely failed to prevent the Russophile decline. By the early 20th century, the Russophiles became a minority in Galicia. Within the church, they were nicknamed Bisons, Imskolahimkas words, an ancient, shaggy species on the verge of extinction. Of 19 Ukrainian periodicals published in Galicia in 1899, 16 were Ukrainophile in orientation. Only 2 were Russophile in orientation and 1 was neutral. In the 1907 elections to the Viennese parliament, the Ukrainophiles won 22 seats while the Russophiles won 5. But the Russophiles, due to Polish interference, won elections to the Galician parliament the same year by taking 11 seats, the Ukrainophiles 10. In 1913, 30 Ukrainophile and only 1 Russophile delegate were sent to the Galician Diet. There were certain regional patterns in the support for Russophilism, in that it was most popular in the extreme western parts of eastern Galicia, particularly in the Lemko region centered on the city of Przemysl. This region, closest to Polish ethnographic territory, may have been most receptive to Russophilia's radical differentiation of Ukrainians, Ruthenians from Poles.